Yes, welcome. This is F Rap Critic. I'm your boy Malik 16, founder and creator of F Rap Critic and the Rap Ruler and Plates and Crates. And no, I'm not an alcoholic, but yes, I do serve them in real life. And since I said the name of the group, it should come as no mystery. The album that we're going over today is a part of a batch of underrated classic albums. At least I consider them to be underrated classics. And this is another selection from my personal collection of classic albums that kind of rhyme. So you could consider this an extension of the little birthday period where I show a little bias. And because this is another album that turned 25 in the year 2022, there's no way that I can let so much time pass without acknowledging it, shining some light on this joint. So we're going to get into it right after you take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. This is category 1, where we go over the album, the product itself. A little background on this album. This is the 3rd studio offering from the trio known as the Alkaholiks, later known as the Licks. It came out in August of 1997 on Loud Records. They were one of the first groups on Loud Records. Shout out to Steve Rifkin. And yeah, let's get into it. You might see me leaning in the camera a little bit every now and then so I can show off my little mini afro. Let's jump into Dimension 1, the quality of the production. Now, it should be noted that E Swift has always been the main producer for the group. He also showcases his skills as a rapper in the group, but he is the beat provider and the soundscape maker. And one thing that the Licks always do is reach out and have one major East Coast producer on every album when they do outsource for outside production. And what I mean by East Coast producer, someone who's known mainly for providing beats for East Coast rappers. It's a part of the Licks' whole aura and space in the industry as kind of the bridge between worlds, as these big time West Coast representatives that didn't fit the typical West Coast mold. And we'll talk more about that as we go down the line. But it should be of note, you get outside production from the likes of Easy Mo B this time around. In the past, it's been Diamond D. In the future, it's been Pharrell. And so this is no different. Now, you also get contributions from a producer named T Smooth and 2 offerings from extended Liquid crew member Madlib on this album. And so beyond that, E Swift is handling the bulk of the production, and you're going to get what had become at that point some signature sounds from E Swift and some experimental sounds as well. So experimental sounds that you'll get, what I mean by that is that E Swift likes to play with sounds that are unconventional, and I think E Swift is responsible for introducing a lot of sounds into hip-hop, but doesn't get his credit for it. And so on this album, you'll hear what it become his knack for using Western inspired sample sounds. And by Western, we're not talking West Coast sounds, we're talking Western movie kind of inspired sounds. So you can't even call it country music. It's the kind of twangy instrumentation that you'd hear in old Western films. And so you're getting that kind of wah-wah sound, crazy organ manipulation, and it's over the most boom bap drums to perfectly complement it. And we're talking crisp boom bap. A lot of producers in this era were doing murky boom bap production, but this is crisp, like straight out the $10 show circuit boom bap hip hop for the purists, right? So you take a beat like Contents Under Pressure, where the guitar sound, the string instrument sound he's using is this wind up cranky banjo kind of over this booming bass and drum kick, and that's the whole beat, and it just rocks and knocks the whole time. But you'll hear distortion in the sound effects and the sounds in the background to fill the beat out. That's what E Swift likes to play with as far as dirtiness. But for the most part, his main instrumentation melodies are going to be crisp and clean. And so you'll hear that on beats like Funny Style, which samples the James Brown classic that was famously used for poetry on the Criminal Minded album from Boogie Down Productions. And all he does is give it a 90s update, but it still sounds fresh enough to feel like it's not this old school track. More to the original production side, beats like Pass Out sounds like desperado music. Captain Hook, it's supposed to feel like it's using like a sitar or some kind of Middle Eastern instrument. You'll hear the same kind of sounds on Captain Hook on the Liquid Riders beat. The defining factors there are those crazy bass lines. And speaking of flutes, E Swift is no stranger to flutes. When he's not using string instruments, he's using flutes very artfully, right? And so you take a song like All Night, which is a big, direct sample from the Stevie Wonder track Too High off his Intervisions album, but they turn it into a party jam because they're adding, real flute instrumentation in the background to fill out. So it's not just ripping that classic electro bass line from Stevie, it's also adding this texture to it with these beautiful flutes. Swift was incorporated live instrumentalists in there, live music players in the sessions, and so you get that real musical feel. And then one thing that E Swift is never shy to play with, and you'll see this on later albums, are sounds that all bleed into the theme of Alkaholic. So the standout track being Hip Hop Junkies, which lifts a riff from an old Marley Marl production, which is just the intro on the video to the classic posse cut. Some say the genre-defining posse cut, the Symphony. So anyone who's familiar with the video remembers this is where all the rappers on that song were being introduced. It's like the little skit part. It wasn't even really a beat. It's a piano riff that's being played by the Marley Marl character. And so Marley Marl is credited on this track as a producer because it honestly was his piano melody in the first place. What E Swift does is ingeniously come in and turn that into a full beat, adding bottle clanking sounds as main parts of the four count. And so, for every you hear the bottles clinking, and it just made for a really, really dope radio edit when it came time for the censored version of the song to get played. Instead of the curse words, it would just be bottles breaking, which didn't sound like anything super crazy because you hear the bottle clanging already in the track, so it sounded like it was all on purpose. Just masterful stuff with whistles in the background. Swift plays with everything in his arsenal in intentional ways. Sometimes you hear producers who sound like they do things accidentally, and not the case. And so what could be appreciated here is that Easy Mo B follows suit. Even though he's an outside producer, he gives them a track that kind of falls in line as this bing sound in it, and it sounds like something that E Swift would have incorporated. With that said, E Swift gives you a range. And so the contributions here from Madlib, who was then not widely known as a producer, this was kind of like the burgeoning of Madlib at the time, was two sides of a coin. You get one beat that could be viewed as a little lazy, tore down, didn't have a lot of elements to it. It's this basic, a couple notes here. It's supposed to just be one of those tracks that people leave open to rap over. There's not any real melody to it. It just kind of hits, a couple notes here, bam, bam, and the rappers do what they do over it, which is in contrast to the track Killing It, which used to be my favorite joint. Again, another producer who seems to manipulate sounds that you would hear off bottles. So he's using these wet sounds for the main beat, but in this hypnotic way that makes it feel like one of the darker tracks on the album. And then the main melody sounds like it's being played off of tuning instruments with hollow bottles. And so, a very standout cut. And Madlib, you can argue maybe he wanted to give you two sides purposely, so you get to see that he can do a little lighter beat and a darker beat, or maybe he was lazier on the other track. But all this is something to consider when you're thinking about the production on this album and the quality of it on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 2. We're talking about the cohesiveness of that production. So not a big party, just a few heads, just a few chefs, not enough to ruin the kitchen here. E Swift is still doing 80% of the production on here. So the contributions from Madlib, Easy Mo B, and the co-credit to Marley Marl and T Smooth don't do anything to take away or deviate, because I just pointed out how in line their production is with the rest of the album. These sound like beats that E Swift could have made himself or would have made himself. Altogether, you're getting a mostly mid to up-tempo album. The idea is to keep the party going. The only time you get some slower moments is on tracks like Keep It Pouring, Feel the Real, and Killing It is honestly one of the slower tracks, but they're trying to maintain this vibe of things just going. There's not a lot of time for anything too dark, nothing gothic, nothing creepy, nothing, you know, super moody, but there's an element there of fullness. All the beats on here are full. Yeah, so when we're talking about big samples, right? Funny Style, Off the Wall, Hip Hop Drunkies, All Night, and then All Shh, which borrows from the Fatback Band and seems to be a nod to, you know, other classic Alkaholiks songs like Damn. Real simplified, but because there's original production on this album that relies heavily on simplified production, none of this seems out of place. They all just kind of bleed into each other. There's distant soulfulness on the more energetic tracks, and there's an increased soulfulness on those slower tracks that I mentioned because there's more musicality to it. I think about the guitar solo that comes on the end of Keep It Pouring, or just how intricate the sampling is on Feel the Real with the guitar playing. Feel the Real is probably the most mood-inducing track on here. I remember when this came out, the review said that was too smooth, but it was the right kind of smoothness on an album that only wants to wade in mid-tempo to up-tempo territory. And you could argue that it was much needed because you needed that mood change to make it feel musical. Another thing that I failed to mention for the cohesiveness is you're gonna hear DJ scratches all throughout this album, whether it's on the Easy Mo B track, the Madlib track, or the tracks produced by Swift himself. Because they're so hip-hop based and all of them have DJ roots, you're still getting that element represented nicely on this album. And it helps glue the album together because no matter who produced it, because you get scratches here and there throughout every other track, it feels like it was all intentional. So these are all things to consider on the scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats when you're thinking about how well it all flows together. There is a cohesiveness because the producers seem like they were really in the same mind frame and had the same sonic goal. Now, when we think about thematic goals, that takes us to dimension 3, the question of intentional mood or tone. Does this album have an intentional mood or tone? Sonically, if we say that it wants to stay in this mid-tempo, up-tempo pace, then there's this intentional vibe of not slowing you down too much to have you wallow in any particular space. They want you to enjoy the rhymes, enjoy the vibe, enjoy the party feel while still thinking a little bit splashed in there. Now, rhyme-wise and thematically, there's skits. There's a lot of skits on the album, and the skits all seem to, there's 2 different kinds of skits going on here. One skit theme is supposed to be packaging the album up in the vein of this being one long AA meeting. And so you'll get revisits. I think there's 2 or 3 revisits to that idea that it's an AA meeting, an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, but then they kind of lose themselves with it. There's no closeout for that, so you don't get a full theme there. It's just an idea that was played with. Same thing with the skits. You get these skits where they're interviewing different artists in the industry and asking them what they like to drink, what their favorite drinks are, or what drinks they use the most for different purposes. And that doesn't seem to have a lot of follow through because they come sporadically, randomly, and it could have really been one or the other, honestly. It's like, had they stuck with the AA theme and did maybe 1 or 2 more, especially one at the end to wrap it all up, then it may have felt like a neatly packaged idea and concept. But the skits asking people about their favorite drinks, that had a life of its own. So maybe it should have just been that without the AA. It just seemed a little all over the place. So that throws it off. Now musically, beats, rhymes together, the idea is that the licks are doing what they do best. It feels very much like a third album. There's nothing really to prove out here, but you can see there was a bigger effort made to have guests on this album and name guests, and we'll talk more about that when we go into Dimension 6. But maybe the idea was the Licks not ever being a group that was shy from making radio and club accessible music, but making it organically. It doesn't seem like there was any particular agenda on this album. But y'all tell me, what did y'all pick up on? Did y'all hear main thread throughout this album? Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to Dimension 4, the song distinction versus the repetition of words and sounds. Because you're getting such a range from E Swift, there's not a lot of obvious production repetition, but there will be moments because he likes to play in the same kind of tempo territory, and because some of the same sounds will get used, and because there's just a lot of songs on this album. So by the time you get to the tail end, when you start hearing Pass Out and Rockin' with the Best, Contents Under Pressure, and Liquid Riders, you've heard many of these sounds already, and there might be a feeling of none of those are standout tracks because you've heard these sounds. Rhyme-wise, similarly, because the Alkaholiks play to the alcoholic brand so much, you may feel like, how much can they talk about drinking liquor and getting drunk? And then there's that other undercurrent that they're a part of because it's 1997, and this is the follow-up year to that divisive year, underground versus mainstream, which was louder than ever. Like, we heard the underground versus mainstream talk in the early 90s with people saying they don't want to go commercial, but now there were more words to describe it. You hear Tash going hard on the R&B singers for some reason, and you'll hear J-Ro going hard on fake rappers. That's kind of the MO there. Those two ideas get ran probably about as far as they can get ran on a rap album. Fake rappers, pretty boy rappers, singers, and getting drunk. You're gonna get a lot of that. And then there's moments in between, but we'll talk about that in the next dimension. So if you put it all together, not a lot of the same words. You know, at the end of the day, the licks are wordsmiths, and so they're playing with a lot of vocabulary here, a lot of references. You might hear beer mentioned a lot and liquor a lot, but not a lot of repetition with words, but with ideas and sounds. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Takes us to Dimension 5, the amount of content versus the amount of songs. This album has 22 tracks, 7 of them being skits. So if you don't count the 7, then you have 15 tracks. That already puts them in the danger zone past the classic amount. We talk about on this channel how the highest number on an album track listing you want to go to play in the classic album territory is 14, except for those rare exceptions. Licks may fit into this rare exception, but they definitely pushed it. 15 just shows you that maybe if they shaved 3 songs, just 3, they would have been in that very safe area of 12, which is ideal for a classic album, if not 10. And so with that, the idea of content comes in these small spaces. The Licks are not a group that are known for giving you heavy food for thought rap. They have branded themselves as the party rappers. They're like the Black Beastie Boys with more defined rap skills, right? And they were comfortable with dropout frat house rap, if that makes sense. They weren't pandering to any college crowd. They were still street based without giving you gangster criminal tales. They're like, let's have a good time. We're not gonna dance, but we're gonna make party music and just real hip hop music. And they always kind of escaped any particular box because of that. But with that, the expectation for heavy thinking man's lyrics the bar is set low for the Alkaholiks to begin with. But surprisingly, they always do give you content, and it's going to come more in the form of stories, concepts, and mini messages. So you hear a track like Keep It Pouring. J-Ro even says to you, I'm not trying to preach you, just trying to reach you. Moments on tracks like Contents Under Pressure. There's a line on the song where J-Ro says, it seems that the majority of my peers want to talk about murder and drug sales. So there's these enlightened moments that I think the Licks were doing that thing that other like-minded rappers were doing, which we have famously called putting the candy in the medicine. Because they knew they weren't these conscious rappers, or even on a mission to swerve in that lane, they're like, look, here's how we raise awareness, here's how we take accountability and sprinkle some responsibility in our rap, and there you go. Feel the Real being the heaviest track on this album, and then lines you get in between. But on a 22-track album or a 15-song album, only having, 4 to 5 songs, only 2 of them being full songs with some substance, and the others being conceptual pieces and bits, you might argue that's not enough of a balance. That's all something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Takes us to Dimension 6. We mentioned this earlier, the features. Yeah. So at this point, the Liquid crew was more than just an extension of their mentor and longtime collaborator King T, who's featured on the album on the track Funny Style and does his thing on there. But now, instead of that just being some inner crew lingo, the Liquid crew is an established collective in the era of everyone having a collective, mostly because people had come to know Exhibit, and then Loot Pack was burgeoning, and then you start getting the introductions to rappers like Feel the Agony and Defari Root. And now you're getting this picture of who the Liquid crew is, because on the underground scenes, all of these rappers at this point at least had some white label vinyl out there circulating. I had heard of all of these rappers on underground radio somehow, but with the understanding that the Licks, the Alkaholiks, are the heart, the base, the foundation, even though it all stemmed from King T. Loot Pack, of course, being the group that Madlib got his start from as a rapper and a producer. So he shows up on this album on the track Tore Down, which he produced, also rapping on that. And so Exhibit's presence on there, because his solo career had taken off from the popularity of his singles, makes them a more enticing collective, instead of it just being these rappers you never heard of. You know King T, you know the Licks, you know Exhibit. It makes you more open to hearing Loot Pack and Feel the Agony. Now you get outside features from rappers like the Who Riders from Oakland, shout out to the town, another underrated duo that doesn't get their props in hip-hop history. And then you also get Keith Murray and the iconic feature of Old Dirty Bastard, which is a match made in heaven on Hip Hop Junkies. Now it's up to you if you consider the talking cameos from people in the industry as features, right? Because you have LL Cool J on here, you have James and El DeBarge. Yeah, you also have Nas, but they don't rap, it's not musical, they're just talking about the drinks they like to drink. You know, it's up to you where you want to put that. Now, was it a clout move back in the day? Could be argued, yeah. Listen, the more names you have on your album, the better you look. You look like you're pulling from your industry relationships, which the Licks had a lot of. They were humble about it, but they had them. Now, as far as the quality of these features, half of the features on this album do it justice, and the other half seem like maybe not so much. Which halves? Again, that's up to you to decide. But on Liquid Riders, neither of the Who Rider members are riding the beat, which is only made worse when J-Ro and Katash do their verses, because they show up dressed to kill. They rap in pocket, and it emphasizes how much the Who Riders weren't doing the beat any justice, which, if you really want to add insult to injury, is just made worse by the reality that they really catered to them and used the beat very similar to Who Riders' most popular single, Talking About Bank, with the bass line. And so that should have been like the open door to just murder the beat. But it creates this non-memorable performance. Same thing can be said about Loot Pack, as they're kind of going duo for duo on this track, but J-Ro and Taz show quickly why they are the more seasoned group. Neither of the Loot Pack rappers do anything that stands out on their verses, and one verse doesn't even have that many rhyming lines. Now, for a verse that has lots of rhyming lines but absolutely nothing to it, Keith Murray. Keith Murray shows up on Off the Wall but says a whole lot of nothing. It just sounded like a freestyle, and again, compared to J-Ro and Tash, sounded kind of amateurish. And so you take that into account. Same thing can be said about Feel the Agony on Rockin' with the Best. It sounded like he was just cutting his teeth and getting his chops up as a new member of the Liquid family, and it was evident. But where things come into harmony is features like Exhibit on Killing It. Exhibit comes at the very end, gives you this contrast in voice that you didn't know you need, because again, he's got that gruff presence, and it's because it's one of the darker beats on the album, he's the perfect person to have on that track. So it's a great complement of sounds, voices, tone, and what he's saying rocks and adds some gravitas to what's going on, because Tash comes in really, thorough. J-Ro kind of softens it out a little bit with his like bridge that he does, but Exhibit comes back and adds that grit, that gristle to the end of it. Exhibit pops up at the end of Osh as well, and there's a personality joke that he provides there, so there's the value that he adds to that. It's an unexpected pop-up. He could have not been on it, but he just adds a little texture to it. Now, for the main event here, Old Dirty Bastard on Hip Hop Drunkies. At this point, Old Dirty's rep preceded him. We knew him more for his antics in this point in the 90s than for his raps. So to hear him on this track, I don't know if they caught him in a good space, at a good time, on a good night, but Old Dirty, it seems like he was re-inspired to rap again. In the folklore and legend of Wu-Tang, it was known that Old Dirty was one of the sharpest, one of the most in-depth with his 5% Nation studies, a master beatboxer, and a really, really clever rapper back in the days before he fully embraced this persona of the crazy drunken style. But if somebody's going to go with a drunken style, what better song to pop up on the Hip Hop Drunkies? Tash rapped like he was trying to impress Old Dirty. He's like, F your bougie show, I got my own special guest. And Dirty rap like he was trying to impress himself, where he's coming with patterns that you never heard him do, more syllables than you ever heard Dirty rap, and more rhyme schemes for longer periods than you heard Dirty rap in a while. It was more than just the talking style that we had got used to, the irreverent, he was like, extra llama, extra. Let a nigga rotate, turn on the table, pull the diamond needle, put it to your ego. What, you the king of the chair on the crown? Tyson will sound, it's 20 seconds to a round. Scavenger nigga, use a shrimp. A whole lot of, wow, man, like, shout out to that collaboration, because they just sounded like they all bounced off and fed off each other's energy so organically. I don't know how hard it was to get that collab. Dirty, his presence electrified that song, and everybody did their thing on that. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats when you're thinking about the quality of the features and if they help the album or hurt it. Takes us to Dimension 7. The question of, does the weakest song or do the weakest songs on this album bring it down? As I always mention, it's subjective, but because there are so many songs on here, 22 track album, 15 songs, there's a lot of room for there to be tracks on there that you have deemed skippable. Some tracks more obvious than others. I think Off the Wall easily becomes a track that, because it was sounding like it was meant to be a single but never became a single, and it sounded like an unnecessary push for a single from a group that made singles, whether they were samples or original music, easily, it just really felt a little weak. And because it's not original production, it's a big blatant sample of another classic hip-hop song. Not to mention that that same year there was a female rap group which dissed me on my blog back in the days when I was a blogger, because I kind of discredited them and called them somewhat one-hit wonders. They had remade the Breaks by Curtis Blow, a group called Not Enough. Shout out to y'all. See, it just seemed like filler, and the fact that Keith Murray didn't really do much on that track just adds to that point. Now, if you don't like some of the guests, you know, I mentioned the same thing with the Loop Pack feature and the track Toe Down, being that this is already a beat that doesn't sound as inspired as the rest of the production on the album, and then the rap features aren't really stand out. You could debate that being a weak track. If you don't like the Who Riders and the track itself, because that didn't have a lot of elements to it, that's another one. Keep It Pouring, if you weren't trying to hear the slowed down song at the end of the album, which sounded like it had a mini message to it, or Feel the Real, which was smooth and musical and about dating life, then that's gonna be there. And then if you don't like big samples, then Funny Style and All Night aren't gonna do it for you either. Rockin' with the Best sounds the most unmixed of all the tracks on this album too. So there's an element of it that doesn't fit in with the quality of the rest of the album. So these are all things to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Again, because there's so many songs, there's a lot of room to consider some tracks weak, and think had they been left off would have made this more of a classic. Dimension 8, Mass Appeal. Now, I mentioned that the Licks have, at this point in their careers, 1997, had come to make records organically that had radio play without making it seem like they were going for that. Things either become club joints or radio joints, and not on any massive scale, because these were always mid-level joints. I don't even know if I can call them hits, but very popular songs that people knew that sounded like it fit with the rest of what you would hear on an album. There's no bait and switch here, and they continue that pattern and that MO on this album. So a track like Hip Hop Drunkies fell right in line with what they've always done. It's like, oh, this is what we want you to do. This is the next installment in the formula that y'all have already created. It didn't sound like a reach. All Night being a follow-up single also didn't sound like a reach, because, okay, this is what we expect. This is party music. The sample is blatant, but it wasn't this super jingly sample. It's the soulful, funky, underrated Stevie Wonder classic. And then Captain Hook, being one of the other singles that were released, is their milder song. It didn't have that element to it. It could be played in the parties like the other two. Radio, you could have seen it had it been serviced properly. This is 1997, where a lot of music got eclipsed by what was going on. And what was going on? The Bad Boy era, the year, Diddy's year, where not a lot was making his reach. You were lucky if you got a hit on the radio in this year, you were doing something right, because it was a jungle out there. And so Captain Hook could have maybe any other year prior, but it just wasn't strong enough to hit those waves in any impactful way. What results from this is that you get 2 videos in the era of rap acts usually having 3. And so their main video being Hip Hop Drunkies, which, it should be mentioned, Old Dirty Bastard did not appear in, couldn't show up, because, as I stated, this was the time period where Old Dirty was more famous for what he did not do musically. And so the show must go on. The album still needed to come out. When it came out, it needed its push. Couldn't be delayed by the featured guests not being able to show up in the video. And it may have hurt the album's traction because of that, because I remember people anticipating the visuals for such a popular song. That was a strong lead-off cut that made its way around all the mix show circuits coast to coast, and even got some real mid-level radio play in the daytime rotation. But Old Dirty not being in the video made it a less memorable video, because people were like, what's up? What happened? Why wasn't he there? We didn't have social media back then, so all you had was chatter. Now the All Night video, they made up for it, because any era of big budget videos. This being Loud Records, which was kind of like the, not one of the big boys, but big enough where they weren't doing $1 million budgets, but we're gonna spend big money. So All Night Long had this whole speakeasy Harlem Nights on the West Coast theme, where they were in the South though. It was like New Orleans, and you know, you could tell money was spent on it. And Underwater, a beautifully shot video. I remember that. I even believe they went so far that on the video version and some of the radio edit versions on J-Ro's verse, they specified which mix show DJs they shouted out just to appeal to those markets. I remember hearing J-Ro name New York DJs when the single was released, and on the album, those names weren't the same. So, you know, efforts like that show that they were trying to go for a wider reach. Unless you were already a fan or just an underground hip hop fan, it didn't have much commercial success beyond that. It made its way to the middle of the Billboard charts, but it never charted towards platinum or gold, and the licks kind of remained cemented by this Hip Hop Drunkie song being their most popular song of all time. Arguably, Hip Hop Drunkies may be the song that everybody goes to when they think of the Alkaholiks or want to hear at the end of an Alkaholiks set. But because they were making party music, there was no shortage of songs on this album that could have been singles. Osh was intended to be a single. You can tell. Off the Wall, we talked about, probably was intended to be a single. But other songs like Funny Style and Contents Under Pressure, because they have these catchy sing-along hooks, there's a lot of, you know, playground songs or old jingly songs that get repurposed on this album for stuff. Even the hook for Hip Hop Drunkies, the uncensored hook, is something that, you know, you've heard sung before. The hook on Toe Down is from an old 60s folk song, but the original hooks are just as catchy. So something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Takes us to my favorite, Dimension 9, the 3 I's: impact, innovation, influence. Now, the impact of this album, Hip Hop Drunkies not only paid homage to another hip hop classic, but created its own hip hop classic. Again, shined a new light on Old Dirty, gave him some more vitality throughout the rest of the 90s, shined another rap beacon on him, and gave him extended rap life for a minute. Now, as far as the group, it raised their profile, and people at least know them as the Licks or the Alkaholiks because of this album. On songs like All Night Long, they're saying, "It's the Licks, baby, it's the Licks, baby," and they become known by either or. It created this widely accepted nickname alternative for them. Now, as far as innovation, I think the influence is there for a lot of producers who may not even know how to trace the credit back. Swift was not afraid to play with sounds and introduce them. The bottles clinking, the flutes, the modulation, and the way that samples were used. Rappers, because this group didn't have a lot of legs from this album to get widely known in a way where people will directly credit them, I don't know how much room there was for influence. I know I was influenced, Catastrophe being one of my favorite rappers of all time. This album is where I really started knowing the extent of how you could be a punchline rapper without seeming obvious about it. And we'll talk more about that in the next episode. So yeah, shout out to Tash, E Swift, J-Ro. J-Ro and I actually corresponded briefly, was trying to get them lined up to do the interview for this album when it was closer to the actual anniversary time, and it just didn't materialize. But it's never too late. Would love to have any of y'all on the show. Let's make it happen, because matter of fact, we can do it for this album. You can come and rate your own album, or we can do it for 21 and over, which turns 30. And yeah, I would love to have y'all. Got my 40 of water right now as we speak. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. The 3 I's takes us to the final dimension, Dimension 10, the overall timelessness and uniqueness. Now, it's a 1997 album that doesn't really sound like 1997. It's not necessarily the most timeless or the most musical, but it has its own unique element because the production wasn't following any trends at the time. It was doing its own thing. Yes, you get big samples, which were really popular in the mid-90s, but not in that way that it seemed everybody had started doing because they needed to. This was just like, oh, we want to sample Marley Marl and the Juice Crew, let's sample it. And so because there are those distinct moments that created memorable beats, you escape any of that time capsule trap. For the underground, the reason why this album became a classic is because the licks represented something that a lot of hip hop fans wish there was more of. This kind of easygoing, energetic hip hop that didn't come loaded with a lot of stuff, just pure hip hop. When people talk about pure hip hop, this is what they mean. There was no agenda to push. They weren't conscious rappers. They weren't gangster rappers. They were just rappers, and they were rapping at a very high level. And because they were the bridge between East and West, they weren't caught in any of those conversations and always showed love equally. And that's the presence they have in hip hop. And so the Alkaholiks, the group, might even overshadow this album, but that's all something for you to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. And that concludes our Category 1 review of the classic 25-year-old album, Likwidation, by the Alkaholiks, aka the Licks. Join me for video 2 where we go over Category 2, the rap performance on this album. Till then, y'all know what it is. F a Rap Critic. They talk about it while I live it. Words and meth.